The dust of the high plains settled like a shroud on everything Elias Thorne owned, which wasn't much beyond the raw timber of his cabin and the unforgiving acres that stretched to a horizon smeared with the promise of more hardship. He was a man carved from the same unyielding landscape, his silence as vast as the prairie, his eyes holding the kind of loneliness that echoes in empty canyons. Years had passed since the whispers in Abilene had branded him, a shame he carried like a stone in his gut, a quiet reminder of a protection he had failed to offer, a life he had failed to save. Now, his honor was a solitary thing, practiced in the careful tending of his few head of cattle, in the straightness of his fences, in the rare, measured words he offered the world. He was an outcast by choice as much as by circumstance, his heart a fortress against further pain. Miles away, in the burgeoning, brutal town of Redemption, a different kind of dust was settling on a young woman named Mai. She had been carried across an ocean of despair only to be washed up on this shore of cruelty, her name a whisper lost in the cacophony of a strange, harsh tongue. They saw only the slant of her eyes, the silk of her dark hair, and deemed her less, something to be bartered, used, discarded. She moved through the fear with a stillness that was mistaken for vacancy, her small hands clasped, her gaze cast down, but behind that silence was a mind as sharp as obsidian, a spirit tempered in fires they could not imagine. She was a resilient bloom in a wasteland, her perceived weakness a shield that concealed a profound, unyielding strength. The air in the Broken Spur Saloon was thick with the stench of cheap whiskey, stale tobacco, and the uglier exhalations of men who had long forgotten what decency felt like. Jedediah Vance, a man whose arrogance was as expansive as his girth, slammed a near-empty bottle on the scarred bar, his laughter a harsh bark. $10, he bellowed, his eyes, small and mean, fixing on the slight figure of Mai huddled near the storeroom door, a coarse rope loosely tied around one wrist, the other end held by a grubby mule skinner. $10 for the China doll, fresh off the wagon, hardly used. His cronies, Silas and Bart, echoed his cruel amusement, their faces flushed with drink and a shared, predatory gleam. Mai did not flinch, did not cry out. She was a stone in a raging river, enduring the torrent. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird, but her face remained a calm, pale mask. This was the precipice, the culmination of a journey that had stripped everything from her but the core of her being. She had no illusions about the fate that awaited her, bought and sold like chattel. The price was an insult, a final, crushing indication of her worth in this new, savage world. $10. The sum of a life. The finality of it hung in the putrid air, a sentence delivered. Elias Thorne had not intended to set foot in the Broken Spur. He'd come to Redemption for salt and flour, a biannual pilgrimage from his isolated ranch. The murmur of the auction, ugly and sharp, snagged at him as he passed the saloon's bat-wing doors, left ajar to the evening's hesitant breeze. He heard the price, $10, and then the dehumanizing term, China doll, something cold and hard-coiled in his stomach, the ghost of his past shame stirring, whispering that silence in the face of injustice was a complicity he could no longer bear. He was not a man for grand gestures, not a man who sought trouble, but the scene unfolding within those doors was a profanity against the silent, stark dignity of the land he knew, against the very idea of a soul's worth. He pushed through the doors, not with a kick, but with a presence that seemed to suck the raucous sound from the room. The air stilled. Elias was not a large man, but he moved with the quiet authority of the mountains, his gaze sweeping over the scene, missing nothing, the girl, small and still as a cornered fawn, the leering faces of Vance and his men, the rope. His face, weathered and grim, was unreadable, but his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a dangerous light. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the bar, his worn boots making little sound on the grimy floorboards. He pulled a small, worn leather pouch from his vest, the same pouch that held the meager profits of his last cattle sale. He untied the drawstring and counted out $10 silver, the clink of each coin unnaturally loud in the sudden, tense quiet. He placed them on the bar, a small, definitive pile. Vance, momentarily thrown by the stranger's entrance, began to bluster. "Well now, looky here. Another buyer." Elias finally spoke, his voice low, rough like stones in a riverbed, but carrying an unmistakable finality. "She ain't for sale." He didn't look at Vance. His eyes were on the mule skinner holding the rope. Untie her. The Skinner, a brutish man but no fool, sensed something in Thorn's stillness that was more threatening than Vance's bluster. He looked to Vance, who sneered. He paid his money, friend. She's his. Elias didn't argue the point of ownership. He simply wanted the rope gone. He looked at my then, a quick, assessing glance. He saw not a doll, but a person, terrified but unbroken. Come, he said, the single word an offer, not a command. Mai's dark eyes lifted, met his for a fleeting second. What she saw there, amidst the harsh lines of his face, was not the predatory hunger of the others, but something else, something unreadable yet strangely devoid of immediate threat. Slowly, as if testing the air, she rose. The mule Skinner fumbled with the knot, and the rope fell away. Elias turned, without a backward glance at the stunned and resentful men, and walked out, Mai following a pace behind him, a small shadow against the vast, indifferent twilight. He had not bought a person, he had bought her out of a particular hell, into what, neither of them yet knew. The $10 lay on the bar, a small monument to a transaction that meant entirely different things to everyone involved. For Elias, it was the first small payment against an old debt of the soul. For Mai, it was a terrifying, uncertain reprieve. The wind picked up as they left the flickering lights of redemption behind, blowing dust into their faces, a gritty portent of the path ahead. The journey to Elias Thorne's ranch was made in a silence as profound as the star-strewn sky above them. He'd procured a sturdy, if aged, mare for Mai from the livery, paying with the last of his carefully hoarded coins. He rode his own rangy gelding, keeping a respectful distance, a silent sentinel against the vast, whispering darkness of the plains. Mai swayed with the mare's rhythm, her body aching, her mind a maelstrom of fear and a fragile, nascent hope so tenuous it felt like another form of pain. She watched the man ahead, his silhouette stark against the moon-silvered landscape. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since leaving the saloon, yet his actions had been a bulwark against the horror she had faced. She understood little of this land, less of its people, but she understood instinct, and her instinct, honed by survival, told her this quiet man was different. He was not like the others. Not yet, anyway. The ranch, when they reached it in the grey pre-dawn light, was a stark testament to a solitary existence. A small, rough-hewn cabin, a sturdy corral, a lean-to shed, all nestled in a shallow dip of the land, protected somewhat from the relentless wind. It was a place of elemental simplicity, raw and unadorned, much like the man himself. Elias dismounted, his movements economical, and helped Mai down, his touch brief, impersonal, yet surprisingly gentle. He led her into the cabin. It was one room, sparsely furnished, a narrow bunk, a rough table and 2 chairs, a stone hearth where embers still glowed faintly. It was clean, meticulously so. He gestured towards the bunk. You sleep here. He took a worn blanket from a chest and spread it on the hard-packed earth floor for himself. Mai watched him, her eyes wide, unblinking. This was not what she expected. There was no demand, no threat in his posture. He moved to the hearth, added kindling, and soon a small fire crackled, chasing away some of the chill and the deeper shadows. He prepared coffee, strong and black, and offered her a tin cup. She accepted it, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed his. The warmth seeped into her, a small comfort in a world that had offered none. Days turned into weeks. Elias spoke little, but his actions wove a quiet narrative of respect. He left food for her, simple fare of beans, bacon, and sometimes a piece of dried fruit. He never approached her bunk unbidden, never stared, never made her feel like property. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending his small herd, his movements infused with a deep, weary competence. Mai, in turn, began to emerge from her shell of silence. She started by keeping the cabin tidy, a small act of contribution. She mended a tear in his canvas coat with thread she salvaged, her stitches tiny and perfect. One afternoon, Elias found her in the lean-to, gently coaxing a nervous new calf to drink from a bucket, her voice a low, soothing murmur in her native tongue, a sound he hadn't realized he'd longed to hear, any sound from her that wasn't born of fear. The calf, which had resisted all his own efforts, nuzzled her hand and drank. Elias merely nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, but he left a small bowl of sugar by her plate that evening, a rare treat. Her perception, he began to see, was a quiet, powerful thing. She noticed things he, in his brusque familiarity with the land, overlooked: the subtle shift in the wind that heralded rain, the almost imperceptible limp of a horse before it became a problem, the best patches for wild berries. Her silence was not emptiness, but a deep, listening stillness. She learned to bake a rough bread in the Dutch oven, the aroma filling the small cabin with a warmth that went beyond the fire. She began to speak, halting English phrases at first, then more. Sky, rain soon, horse, leg hurts. Elias would listen, grunt an affirmative, or simply nod. Her words were like rare coins, each one valuable. He found himself adjusting the rhythm of his solitary life to include her quiet presence, a presence that was slowly, imperceptibly, filling the vast, empty spaces within him. The shame he carried still lingered, but its edges were softening, blunted by the daily necessity of shared existence, by the unspoken understanding that was growing between them like a hardy prairie flower in barren soil. The fragile piece of their shared solitude was destined to be shattered. The plains had long memories, and the town of redemption, with its festering resentments, was not far enough away. Jedediah Vance had not forgotten the perceived slight, the loss of face, the disruption of his cruel sport by the silent, imposing rancher. His anger, fueled by cheap whiskey and the taunts of his cronies, Silas and Bart, had simmered into a venomous resolve. They saw me not as a person rescued, but as an object stolen, and Elias as a fool who had overstepped. One blistering afternoon, as a hawk circled lazily in the metallic sky, 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking Elias's ranch. Vance, flanked by his 2 sycophants, swaggered even in the saddle. Elias was mending a harness near the corral, Maya a few feet away, scattering grain for the chickens. Her head snapped up first, her body tensing like a drawn bowstring. She had the instinct of hunted prey. Elias followed her gaze, his hand dropping to the worn Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, a familiar weight of preparedness. He didn't draw, but the readiness was there, a silent statement. "Well, well, Thorn," Vance called out, his voice dripping with false bonhomie as they rode closer, stopping just outside the rough fence line. "Didn't expect to find you playing house." His eyes, greedy and contemptuous, raked over my, lingering in a way that made Elias's jaw tighten. "Heard you paid a pretty penny for her." Though $10 ain't much for a man of your discerning tastes, Silas and Bart snickered, their expressions mirroring Vance's insolence. My retreated a step, her face pale, but her eyes, fixed on Vance, held a new defiance, a spark Elias hadn't seen before. It was the look of someone who had found something worth protecting, even if it was just the precarious sanctuary of this harsh place. "State your business, Vance," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Or ride on business?" Vance chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Just a friendly visit. See how our little China doll is faring. Town's been worried about her virtue, you know." With a solitary man like yourself, the insinuation hung heavy in the air, thick and poisonous. Elias's hand didn't move from his side, but his knuckles were white. "She's under my protection. That's all you need to know, protection." Vance's sneer widened. "Or possession? We hear things, Thorn. About men who live too long alone. Men with peculiar needs." He spat on the ground, a deliberate act of defilement. "Maybe she prefers a livelier company. Maybe she wants to come back to town. We'd take good care of her." Bart let out a lewd whoop. Mai took another step back, positioning herself closer to the cabin door, her gaze darting between the men and Elias, a silent calculation in her eyes. She wasn't cowering. She was assessing. Elias felt a cold anger settle deep within him, a dangerous calm. The shame of Abilene was a raw wound, and these men were prodding it with dirty fingers. "She stays," Elias stated, each word a chip of granite. "This is my land. You're not welcome here." "Leave." Vance's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected such direct opposition. He'd thought Thorn a broken man, easily intimidated. "Getting mighty brave, Thorn." Mighty brave for a man with secrets. He let the word hang, a veiled threat. This ain't over. We'll be back. And next time, we might not be so neighborly. He wheeled his horse around, Silas and Bart following suit, their parting laughter ugly and carrying on the wind. As they disappeared over the rise, Elias finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Mai. Her face was still pale, but her chin was set. They bad men, she whispered, her voice tight. I know, Elias said. He looked at the vast, empty horizon from which they had come, and from which they would surely return. The quiet adjustment period was over. The storm he had sensed brewing in the distance had finally announced its imminent arrival. The fragile peace had been a temporary shelter, and now the walls were being tested. The days that followed were taught with a shared, unspoken dread. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the already parched earth, mirroring the dry fear in their throats. Elias moved with a heightened vigilance, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his Colt. He reinforced the cabin door, checked his rifle, counted his meager supply of ammunition. Mai, too, was changed. The quiet resilience she had always possessed now sharpened into a focused intensity. She said little about the impending threat, but her every action was imbued with a fierce determination. She gathered firewood with a desperate energy, ensuring they had ample supply. She meticulously sorted their stores, her small hands moving with an efficiency that belied her fear. She even began to practice with a heavy iron skillet, swinging it with surprising force against an imaginary foe when she thought Elias wasn't looking. He saw, and a grim, protective warmth spread through him. She was not passive. She would not be a victim again. He found her one evening by the creek, her brow furrowed in concentration as she sharpened a long, sturdy piece of driftwood to a wicked point with a shard of flint. "What's that for, eh?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his, devoid of any pretense. "If they come for me," she said, her English still hesitant but her meaning crystal clear, "I will not go easy." He nodded, a lump in his throat. He saw in her then not that the China doll the brutes in town saw, nor even just the resilient outcast he had come to admire, but a warrior in her own right, her spirit as unyielding as the ancient stones of her homeland. The shame of his past, the failure in Abilene, pressed on him with renewed weight. This time, he would not fail. He could not. The storm broke not with thunder and lightning, but with the distant drumming of hooves, a sound that cut through the deceptive quiet of late afternoon. 3 riders again, emerging from the heat haze like specters of malice. Vance, Silas, and Bart. This time, their intentions were nakedly hostile, their faces grim, their hands already resting on their holstered guns. "Thorn!" Vance bellowed, his voice raw with aggression as they pulled up, forming a menacing semicircle before the cabin. "We told you we'd be back. Time to pay for your arrogance." "And the girl, she's coming with us." Elias stepped out of the cabin, his rifle held loosely in his hands, Maya's shadow in the doorway behind him, the sharpened stake clutched tight. "She's not going anywhere, Vance," Elias said, his voice deadly calm. "This is your last chance. Ride out and not without her." Silas snarled, his hand inching towards his gun. The air crackled, thick with imminent violence. It happened fast. Bart, impulsive and eager, went for his pistol. Elias, anticipating it, fired the rifle from his hip. The shot was deafening, kicking up dust near Bart's horse, making it rear. In that split second of confusion, Vance drew, firing wildly. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Elias's shirt, burning his arm. He grunted, dropping to one knee, bringing the rifle up for a more aimed shot. But Silas was already charging, leaping from his horse, a long knife glinting in his hand, aiming for the downed Elias. This was it. The moment stretched, impossibly long. Then, a blur of motion from the doorway. Mai. She didn't scream. She acted. With a guttural cry that was pure, primal fury, she lunged, not at Silas, but at his horse, jabbing the sharpened stake deep into its flank. The animal shrieked, a terrifying sound, and bucked violently, throwing Silas hard to the ground, the knife skittering away. The diversion was all Elias needed. He fired again, his shot hitting Silas in the leg. The man screamed, clutching his thigh. Vance, momentarily distracted by my sudden, ferocious intervention and Silas's cry, hesitated. Elias swung the rifle, the butt cracking against Vance's jaw with a sickening thud. Vance crumpled, unconscious. Bart, seeing his leader and companion down, his bravado vanished, wheeled his horse and galloped away, a coward to the last. Silence descended, broken only by Silas's groans and the heavy breathing of Elias and Mai. Elias got to his feet, his arm bleeding, his body aching, but a fierce, triumphant light in his eyes. He looked at Mai, who stood trembling, the stake still in her hand, her face ashen but resolute. "You all right?" he managed, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her dark eyes wide, searching his. "It hurt just a scratch," he said, though it was more than that. He disarmed the groaning Silas and the unconscious Vance, using their own ropes to bind them. The fight had been brutal, swift, decisive. The cruel collective had been broken, not just by his rifle, but by the unexpected, fierce courage of the woman they had sought to dehumanize. She had not been helpless. Her spirit, forged in unimaginable trials, had been her weapon. As the dust began to settle, a different kind of quiet enveloped the ranch, no longer the silence of fear, but the weary calm after a storm. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, a dramatic backdrop to the aftermath of the confrontation. Elias, his arm bandaged with a strip of cloth Mai had torn from her own sparse belongings, leaned heavily against the corral fence, watching the last of the light fade. Silas, groaning and thoroughly subdued, and Vance, nursing a broken jaw and a shattered ego, were securely tied near the lean-to, awaiting the dawn and the long ride to the nearest town with a proper lawman, a town further west, away from Redemption's corrupt influence. Mai moved with a quiet efficiency, tending to Elias's wound with a gentleness that belied the ferocity she had displayed mere hours before. She had found some herbs by the creek, crushing them to make a poultice, her touch surprisingly skilled. Her silence now was different, it was no longer born of fear or uncertainty, but of a deep, shared understanding, a bond forged in the crucible of violence. "It will heal," she said softly, her fingers brushing his skin as she secured the bandage. Her voice was a balm to his raw nerves. "Thanks to you," Elias replied, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. He looked at her, truly saw her, the immense strength in her slight frame, the unwavering courage in her dark eyes. The shame that had haunted him for years, the ghost of Abilene, began to recede, replaced by a profound respect and something akin to awe. She had not needed his protection in the way he'd imagined, they had protected each other. The ledger of his past felt, for the first time, as if it might one day be balanced. As darkness settled, they sat by the small fire in the cabin, the silence comfortable, companionable. The threat that had loomed over them was gone, vanquished not just by force of arms, but by a shared resolve. Mai traced patterns in the half-dust with a fingertip. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, "why you helped me?" "That day." In Saloon, Elias looked into the flames, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his weathered face. He thought of the $10, the casual cruelty, the way they had looked at her. He thought of his own past, his own failures. "Reckon no one should be bought and sold," he said simply. "Everyone deserves a chance." To be seen, she looked at him, a long, searching gaze. A small smile, hesitant but genuine, touched her lips. "You see me," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a recognition that resonated deep within Elias's soul. In that moment, the $10 he had paid ceased to be a symbol of her degradation, or even his act of rescue. It became the almost insignificant price of a partnership, of a future neither of them could have envisioned. The isolated ranch, once a symbol of his loneliness, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where two outcasts, a stoic protector and a resilient survivor, had found not just safety, but a profound, unspoken connection. Peace settled over them, as vast and as quiet as the starlit prairie. An epilogue, written not in words but in shared sunrises, began to unfold. A year later, the ranch was subtly transformed. Wildflowers Mai had carefully transplanted bloomed in unlikely patches near the cabin. The scent of unfamiliar herbs sometimes mingled with the wood smoke from the chimney. Elias's cattle were fatter, his small patch of corn taller, tended with a shared diligence. He still spoke few words, but his silences were no longer laced with old pain, they were filled with a quiet contentment. Mai's laughter, once a rare sound, now occasionally echoed across the yard, as bright and clear as the morning air. She taught him words in her own tongue, and he listened, his heart open. They worked side by side, a silent symphony of shared purpose. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would watch her trace intricate characters in the dust with a piece of chalk, stories of a faraway land, and he would feel the last vestiges of his old solitude melt away like snow under a spring sun. The $10 had been a pittance, the world's brutal measure of a life. But what had grown from it, in the harsh soil of the frontier, under the vast, watchful sky, was a love as resilient and as precious as life itself, a testament to the enduring strength found in seeing the profound worth in what society had deemed broken. Their future was an open prairie, full of hardship, yes, but also full of a quiet, unshakable hope. If this story of Elias and Mai, of courage found in the desolate corners of the human heart and a love that bloomed against all odds, stirred something deep within your soul, if you believe that even in the face of prejudice and cruelty, the quiet strength of the human spirit can triumph, and that true connection can heal the deepest wounds, if you see the profound beauty in finding worth where others see none, and the quiet heroism in standing for another when the world turns its back, then you have found a kindred spirit here. These are the stories we tell, tales of redemption, of unlikely bonds, and the enduring power of compassion in a harsh world. Subscribe now, and journey with us again as we explore the landscapes of the heart, where even the smallest act of kindness can change everything, and where love, in its purest form, always finds a way to kick down the door of despair.